A king nearly drowned today, in a river 6 feet of cold, brown water. He's thrashing around in his own armor, going under and coming up. While the man who had just humiliated him on the field stood on the opposite bank laughing at him. Stay with me, because what led to this moment is one of the most remarkable rivalries in the history of the medieval world, and what happened after it will genuinely shock you. Like I was surprised during my research, we will be looking at 2 kings with 1 empire, and a war that neither of them started, but only one of them would survive. This is the story of Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus of France, the greatest soldier of his age against the greatest strategist of his age. And by the time we're done, you're going to understand something that most people who know this story completely miss. As you all know, Richard won almost every battle while Philip won the war. Now, before we get to the river, before we get to the chase, and before we get to that bridge, you need to know about the archive. Because in the summer of 1194, Richard didn't just beat Philip on a battlefield, he did something far more destructive. He captured Philip's private correspondence, every letter with every secret arrangement, also every name, and there were many of men inside Richard's own court who had been feeding information to the French king for years. Trusted nobles, men who sat at Richard's table and ate his food and then reported back to Paris. Philip had essentially been reading the blueprints of the Angevin Empire from the inside. Richard took the blueprints back, and for the next 4 years, every move Philip made carried a shadow over it, the nagging, unshakable possibility that Richard already knew what was coming. That is the context for everything that follows. To understand Gisors, you have to know the man at the center of it. Richard I of England, known to his contemporaries as Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart, was not, in any meaningful sense, an English king. He spoke French. He spent less than 6 months of his entire reign on English soil. He thought of himself as the ruler of the Angevin Empire, a vast patchwork of territories stretching from the Scottish border in the north to the Pyrenees in the south. Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, Gascony, more of France than France itself. He was also, by every account we have, the most gifted military commander of his generation, possibly of the entire medieval period. The man had never lost a battle in 15 years of warfare across Europe and the Holy Land. Now Philip Augustus of France was almost his exact opposite. Where Richard was impulsive, Philip was methodical. Where Richard fought from the front, Philip built systems. He was not a great battlefield commander. What Philip understood with a clarity that bordered on genius was that you don't have to beat the best soldier in the world on his terms. You just have to make sure the best soldier in the world is never fighting on his own terms. These 2 men had history that ran deep and strange. They had gone on crusade together in 1190. They had argued almost the entire way. But while Richard was fighting Saladin, Philip was home. And for Philip, being at home meant opportunity. The trap sprung in December 1192. Richard was sailing home from the crusade. After 3 years at war, every battle won, a truce with Saladin finally in place. He should have been untouchable. But Richard had made enemies on his way east, more than he'd realized, more than he'd bothered to keep track of. He had publicly rejected a French princess. He had been connected by rumor and whisper to the murder of a rival king. Also, he had thrown the battle standard of Leopold of Austria from the walls of Acre into the dirt in front of an entire army. Every port in Europe was watching for him, and every Alpine pass was a potential ambush. So Richard sailed with 4 companions, wearing a Templar's cloak, pretending to be no one. But unfortunately, he didn't make it. Leopold of Austria, the man whose banner had been ground into the mud at Acre, arrested him 3 days from the coast. On Christmas of 1192, Richard I of England was captured in a ditch outside Vienna, disguised as a kitchen hand. Philip of France heard the news and treated it like a gift from God. Because Richard being in a German dungeon meant Richard's empire was sitting unguarded. And what Philip did next wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a great military campaign, or should I call it a thundering cavalry charge, because it was quiet, deliberate, and surgical.
If you want to hear more stories like this, battles where strategy defeated strength, where the impossible became real, where one decision changed the course of nations, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter of history.
Philip walked into the spaces Richard had left behind. Gisors fell first, and that matters enormously, so pay attention to Gisors. This was not a minor border fortress. This was the key that unlocked Normandy. It sat above the meeting point of 3 rivers, commanding every major road between Paris and Rouen. Impregnable by any conventional assault. Its walls alone were a strategic argument. It fell without a siege. Its governor, Gilbert de Vascuois, handed over the keys to Philip at a speed that left every loyalist observer in France speechless with fury. Whether this was paid treachery or cold-blooded pragmatism, history doesn't say. The result was the same, and Gisors was French. From there, Philip moved through Normandy methodically, burning what he couldn't garrison, while garrisoning what he could use, taking hostages from towns that might otherwise remember where their loyalties lay. He reached the sea at Dieppe, and then turned the column south toward Rouen, Richard's ancestral capital. The city that meant Normandy was yours if you held it. Philip put it under siege. Meanwhile, back in England, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Richard's formidable iron-willed mother, was imposing a 25% income tax on every subject in the kingdom to raise her son's ransom, 25%, on everything, at a time when most people lived one bad harvest from genuine hunger. The screaming was audible across the channel. Richard's brother John had already ridden to Philip's court and sworn his allegiance, offering to deliver Richard's French territories in exchange for Philip's protection and a promise to finally marry the princess Richard had rejected. The Angevin Empire, the thing Richard and his ancestors had spent a century building, was being divided like a meal, and Richard was in a cell in Germany. Here's what I want you to think about before we go further. Philip has just done something extraordinary. Without fighting a single significant battle, he has taken Normandy's greatest fortress, besieged its capital, acquired Richard's heir, and bought the loyalty of Richard's own brother. Now the question is, when Richard gets out, when the ransom is paid and the devil comes home, does he have anything left to fight with? Comment your thoughts below. Stick with me, because the answer is going to change everything you think you know about this story. Philip heard that the ransom had been raised in early 1194, and he wrote immediately to John, 4 words only: "The devil is loose." Richard landed at Sandwich in March 1194 with 300 ships at his back and 16 months of captivity burning in his chest. He moved through England like a controlled storm. Nottingham fell, Tickhill fell, every castle John had seized was stripped from him within weeks. Richard appeared at Winchester Cathedral in full regalia for what was effectively a second coronation, a public, theatrical, carefully staged declaration that the interlude was over and the king had returned. Then, before England had even fully exhaled, he was gone again, back to France. What Richard did in the summer of 1194 doesn't read like a military campaign. It reads like a man systematically deleting an argument. He hit Verneuil first, where Philip was conducting a siege, and rode his cavalry directly at the French army at such speed that Philip abandoned his artillery in the field and retreated. Richard didn't immediately pursue. He picked up the siege engines, absorbed the town, and pivoted south. Loches fell in a single assault. Chroniclers recorded it with the slightly stunned brevity of men who weren't quite sure what they had witnessed. Tours surrendered and paid.
Here is the coin. Accepted. The city is spared.
Touraine was Angevin again. Philip managed to position his army behind Richard near Vendôme and declared he would attack at dawn. And by dawn, the French were already leaving. Richard chased him. His mercenary captain Mercadier ran ahead of the column with fresh horses, keeping the pressure constant, keeping Richard mounted, and the pursuit crashed through Fréteval Wood until Philip's rearguard stopped being a rearguard and became a dispersal. Then came the baggage train, horses, siege equipment, Philip's treasury, and underneath all of it, the thing that mattered most, the archive. Every letter, every arrangement, every name of every man inside Richard's circle who had taken French coin. Philip signed a truce 3 weeks later on the 23rd of July. He had nothing left to bargain with. The next 4 years were not peace. They were preparation, wearing the mask of peace. Richard built Castle Gaillard, a fortress on a sheer cliff above the Seine, so aggressively positioned that it violated the terms of his truce with Philip simply by existing. He named it the Saucy Castle. Gaillard was Richard's answer to losing Gisors. Where Gisors had blocked the road into Normandy from the east, Gaillard now did the same, and it was newer, higher, and far more formidable. Visiting engineers from across Europe came to study it. Some left without being able to explain how it could be taken. Meanwhile, Richard was working the diplomatic board with the same intensity he brought to the battlefield. Baldwin of Flanders, who had sided with Philip for years, was brought over through a combination of English wool trade pressure and careful negotiation. When England quietly stopped buying Flemish cloth, the economic pain became an argument that Philip couldn't counter. The Holy Roman Emperor Henry died. The electors chose Richard's nephew Otto of Brunswick for the throne. Suddenly, Philip was no longer looking at one powerful enemy. He was surrounded. Richard to the west, Flanders to the north, a friendly emperor to the east. Philip's response was the only one available to him. Then he attacked. In the autumn of 1198, Philip drove into the Vexin. He was burning, looting, running the same punishing column of destruction he had used for a decade, not to hold territory, but to bleed Richard, to exhaust his resources, to make the cost of defending Normandy higher than the value of keeping it. Richard counterattacked immediately. He took back Courcelles-sur-Epte. He took Bury. He pulled his army to Dangu to consolidate what he had recovered. Dangu sits 4 miles from Gisors. And then, somewhere in the French intelligence chain, something broke. A messenger reached Philip with a report. Courcelles, the messenger said, was still contested. The garrison was fighting. Richard had not yet secured his position. It was completely wrong. Richard had already taken Courcelles. The garrison was gone. The Angevin flags were already above the walls. But Philip rode. Several hundred knights, fast-moving, no siege equipment, no contingency plan, just heading for a town they believed was still in play. Richard was on patrol near the perimeter when his scouts found him. He turned his column immediately and rode hard for the intercept. The French arrived at Courcelles and saw smoke rising from the buildings, Angevin banners on the walls, and no sign of any ongoing fight. Philip had perhaps 3 seconds to understand what this meant. Then the crossbow bolts came from the tree line, and Richard's cavalry appeared on the ridge. What happened here lasted miles. The French broke without organizing a defense, men without horses abandoned on the spot, the mounted knights scattering toward Gisors, with Richard's entire force behind them. Running skirmishes erupted all along the river Epte as Richard's riders cut off the slower French, unhorsed knights in open fields, dragged men from their saddles in the shallows of the river. Richard himself took 3 knights prisoner with a single lance. He put this in writing afterward. The pleasure is audible across 8 centuries. Philip could see Gisors now, the great towers above the river, the bridge, safety. He was going to make it. And then every man behind him who had the same thought tried to get across that bridge at the same time, but the structure collapsed under the weight. Hundreds of armored knights with horses, weapons, and their equipment, all of it went into the Epte at once. Philip went under. His armor, the formal heavy armor of a king, not the lighter battle kit of a man who expected to be fighting today, pulled him straight down into cold water and black silt. Knights were crashing into him from above. Horses were screaming and rolling in the shallows. Men who couldn't get clear of their saddles went down with their horses. 20 knights drowned that afternoon. 100 more were pulled from the riverbanks and taken as prisoner. 200 horses were seized. Philip's men got their hands on him, dragged him choking and half-drowned to the bank, and carried him through the gates of Gisors, while the garrison on the walls tried to provide cover. From the opposite bank, Richard watched. He told his companions, among them William Marshal, the greatest knight in England, that Philip was getting a well-deserved drink after his long ride. For the French king, shivering by a fire inside the castle he had stolen 6 years earlier, it was the worst day of his life. In January 1199, the two kings met on the Seine to sign a 5-year truce. Richard stood on a boat. Philip stood on the bank. They shouted at each other across the water, the last act in a decade of rivalry that had reshaped the map of northern France. By any reasonable measure, Richard had won. Every territory Philip seized during the captivity had been recovered. Castle Gaillard dominated the Seine. Philip's spy network had been burned to the ground at Fréteval. Philip himself was politically weakened, surrounded by enemies Richard had placed there, and had recently almost drowned in his own conquest. On the 26th of March, 1199, a crossbow bolt fired from the walls of Chalus caught Richard in the left shoulder. The wound was small, the treatment was poor. Gangrene set in over 11 days. Richard I, the Lionheart, the man who had never lost a battle, who had humiliated Philip Augustus on a dozen fields and watched him nearly drown in a river, died on the 6th of April, 1199. He was 41 years old. Philip Augustus of France outlived him by 24 years. And in those 24 years, with no Richard to stop him, Philip did what he had always been building toward. He dismantled what remained of the Angevin Empire piece by piece, stripped Normandy, Anjou, and Maine from the English crown, and laid the foundations for the France we recognize today.
And the darkness around it.